Thank you all for coming, and I particularly want to thank Ambassador Parkin Cook for his warm hospitality, for his invitation, and for the extraordinarily perceptive, challenging, and insightful questions he has posed. Since I have actually heard this lecture many times before, I would be happy to go straight to my answers to your questions, but I'm not sure our audience would appreciate that. So I hope and trust that in our dialogue, Sukjong, I may have some time to respond to these questions because I think they are deeply insightful, very challenging, very much things that have been on my mind and things we are struggling with. And of course, Frank Fukuyama's office is about 10 steps down the hall from mine. I can begin by saying two things. Number one, we talk about these issues all the time. And obviously we have a very deeply friendly and interactive relationship. And I regard Frank Fukuyama as really one of the greatest intellects in the study of political development of not only our generation, but many generations. And the second point I'll make is no book in my lifetime has been more deeply misunderstood and more frequently mischaracterized than Frank's book, The End of History. But we'll talk about that. Now, I want to begin by asking the question, are we suffering from a crisis of democracy? By making clear what we're talking about. I think it's extremely important to understand that democracy is not just a system of government in which people can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in regular, free and fair elections, which in itself is a very, very high standard, by the way. A lot of countries claim to be democracies, like Malaysia, as we were talking about this morning at a conference that Sukjong Lee organized. They have multi-party elections, they have some pluralism in civil society, but elections are not fully free and fair. The media is controlled, and you don't really have democracy. Even if you have truly open, competitive, free and fair elections, you may not have other elements of what constitutes a liberal, in the political sense, or high-quality democracy. And we're not just struggling for democracy, we're struggling for freedom and just society and the rule of law and good government and fair and equal treatment for all citizens and a quality state that can continue to deliver prosperity to the society. So I will just summarize a lot of work I've done on the quality of democracy by saying that you can aggregate these 9 or 10 dimensions of the quality of democracy into 3 themes. And these 3 themes are in tension with one another. The challenge for any society is to find some way of balancing them because you can't maximize them all at the same time. If all you have is an extreme form of popular sovereignty, that risks descending into something that our constitutional founders in the United States rightly and I think quite presciently feared, which is the potential for tyranny of the majority. In the end, when you have direct plebiscitary democracy that has no respect for the rule of law, no respect for checks and balances and constitutional constraints, for the system of what I call horizontal accountability, it can descend not only into a tyranny of the majority, but ultimately authoritarianism of a popularly elected populist. That is what has happened in Hungary. That is what has happened in Turkey. That is what happened before in Russia. And it's a fairly common trajectory and one on which the Polish government is now fairly well advanced. So majority rule has to be tempered with two other dimensions that ensure that whoever wins elections will be held accountable to the Constitution and the rule of law, will understand that they have temporary custody of power, and victory in an election does not mean permanent entrenchment in power, that they have to answer to the people, the courts, other agencies of horizontal accountability like the counter-corruption apparatus, the press, and the rule of law. And so these other two dimensions of Republican government, good government with a strong rule of law and vigorous checks and balances, and a vigorous, truly independent judiciary that is then able to defend freedom of all kinds, individual rights, group rights, property rights, are extremely important counterbalances against the potential for the popular sovereignty dimension to descend into authoritarianism as it has been doing in a number of countries, and which now represents, I would argue, the principal challenge to democracy in the world. I want to talk about 5 key trends of a democratic recession that I first identified more than a decade ago, and that I think has been accelerating in the last 2 years in particular. So that in the recent period of time, 2 years, 3 years, something like that, we have been moving from a period in world history which I have called the Democratic Recession, but about which there was much dispute among academics as to whether we were really in it, to a period where I think no serious scholar can dispute that we're in some kind of problem for democracy globally, some kind of slippage or recession. And the question people are now asking, which is the question of this lecture, is this no longer a recession, but a crisis? The 5 dimensions are, first of all, declining levels of freedom and democracy in the world, which I will show you, and in fact 11 consecutive years of decline. Secondly, and more recently, a wave of illiberal populism, which I want to explore and try and understand. Third, increasing polarization and social intolerance, which is being made demonstrably worse by the very social media that we thought, I'll be honest, that I thought were going to be largely liberating and invigorating for democracy. Fourth, along the lines of what Ambassador Park raised, the continued projection of power, self-confidence, a different normative agenda by China, and other authoritarian powers, most notably Russia. And fifth, the argument, it needs to be further interrogated, that democratic values have been decaying in Europe and the United States. I want to begin by just showing the trends in democracy in the world since the beginning of the third wave of global democratization in 1974. I'm following the framework that Samuel Huntington laid out in his book, The Third Wave, and going through the end of last year. Now, the red line on top signifies the percentage of states in the world with population over 1 million that can be said to be electoral democracies. This number represents my estimate at the end of each year, usually making minor amendments to the count of Freedom House, based on the fact that I think Freedom House is sometimes too generous and recognizes as democracies some countries that aren't quite, or fails to see, as in the case of Russia, the case of Venezuela, the case of Turkey, now the case of Bangladesh, as early as I think it needs to be seen, that a democracy has slipped below the line of electoral democracy into something that we call competitive authoritarianism. And the blue line at the bottom is liberal democracy. that is those countries in the world that have relatively high levels of these 10 different features of democratic quality. Now, how do we measure liberal democracies? I'm just going to tell you the admittedly crude way that I am doing it here. It's a first cut, it's not perfect. As you know, or many of you know, the organization in New York and Washington, Freedom House, rates all the countries in the world on two scales of political rights and civil liberties every year. And the best score on those scales is a 1, and the worst score is 7. So this blue line is counting as liberal democracies all the states in the world that get one of the two best scores, a 1 or a 2 out of 7, on both political rights and civil liberties. So if they have fairly liberal scores on both political rights and civil liberties, I count them as liberal democracies. And here what you see is that the percentage of democracies in the world, of course, took a big jump with the end of the Cold War in 1989. And then it continued expanding gradually, and it peaked at around 2006 at 58% of the world's states. And then it began subsiding, and it hasn't improved since. It's flattened out at a smaller majority of about 54% of the world's states. And frankly, if you take out some more countries that are rather questionable, it would be just barely over 50%. In terms of liberal democracies, you can see that the percentage of larger states over 1 million that meet a modest test of liberal democracy, again, in the early 90s began to expand, peaked at about a third of all states, and has slipped back slightly, okay? Now, if you're just looking at these numbers, what do you see? You see two things, I think, that I want you to notice. Number one, each of these lines, and others I'll show you, experience an inflection point at around 2006. And after that, democratic progress net in the world essentially ceases and begins to subside. And secondly, the subsiding is modest. It's not a crisis, okay? If you're just looking at the gross numbers, we're in a period here, according to these numbers, of recession. It's been a protracted one, but it isn't a disastrous one. The result is that by the end of 2016, going on these numbers, you had a situation where democracy was present to some degree in most regions of the world. There are only two regions of the world where there really wasn't, I'd say, a very viable critical mass of democracies in the world, and that's the 12 states of the former Soviet Union outside the three Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and then the Middle East and North Africa. The former Soviet Union had no liberal democracies. Middle East and North Africa have, Israel and Tunisia, if you're just kind of looking within the borders, the formal recognized borders of Israel. In Asia, this is including East, Southeast, and South Asia. It's a mixed picture. You've got about half of all the countries in the region, including countries less than 1 million population, being democracies, only a smaller number, like Korea, being liberal democracies. But then you've got, Europe, the Pacific Island states, Central and Eastern Europe, that's the third set of bars on the left, and Latin America and the Caribbean, with most countries being democracies, quite a large percentage being liberal democracies. And note that even in sub-Saharan Africa here, about 2 out of every 5 states are democracies. Now I'm going to answer one of your questions, Ambassador Park. And this is true about India as well. See, I'll try and sneak in these answers as I go along. The countries of the 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are doing the best in terms of economic growth are, with one or two exceptions, the democracies of sub-Saharan Africa. We have demonstrated, and if you want to see the evidence, go to a book by the economist at Georgetown University named Steve Radelet, R-A-D-E-L-E-T, called Emerging Africa, with evidence that this is so and continues to be so. And, you know, compare the economic growth rate of a country like Ghana with some of its more authoritarian neighbors, and you'll see the point. And once democracy becomes more liberal, it tends to do better. And it is the case now, I want to also underscore, since I'm on the subject, that the major economy in the world with the highest growth rate is no longer China, it's India. And sophisticated observers of the world economy expect that will be true for the next decade. I think India is going to show, as Ghana has shown, and as several other sub-Saharan African countries have shown, as South Korea showed after its transition in 1987, that you can get, frankly, quite good economic growth under democracy. And I don't make the claim for democracy on the basis that people are going to be better off in material terms if they live under democracy. I think there's a good chance in many circumstances they will be. If I had a lot more time, I could explain why, particularly in Africa, I think democracy is an asset for economic development. But all I need to do to make a claim for the superiority of democracy over authoritarianism is to make the argument, which I think is intellectually straightforward and empirically sustainable, that there's no logical reason and there's no broad empirical evidence to show that democracy is a disadvantage for economic development. What you need for development, you know, are good policies that promote investment and incentives to improve human capital and improve physical capital and have good governance with the rule of law, which frankly you're more likely to get under democracy than under authoritarianism. All right. Now, this, of course, needs to take into account that there are still many fragile and illiberal countries that are being counted as democracies or that are sometimes considered democracies. I don't count Zimbabwe as a democracy in this material here, and I don't even count Hungary as well. But Poland is sliding fast. Nigeria is in a very iffy state. I predict there's going to be real chaos tomorrow in Kenya after an election in which I think it's increasingly obvious that the ruling party is going to rig itself back into power, as I believe it's done twice before. I hope the country doesn't erupt into violence as a result of that. But are we going to once again call that a democracy, as Freedom House does, simply because the people decide they would rather accept this electoral fraud than have the country descend to the brink, as it did in 2007 and 2008, of civil war over the disputed elections? Anyway, you're all in the region here. You know what's going on in the Philippines, and I suspect probably Indonesia. And as I'll explain, with the election, I think very clearly, of an illiberal populist as president of Mongolia, we've got a lot of fragility in these numbers. All right, these are the global trends in freedom. Remember, the two scales go from 7, which is least free, to 1, which is most free. If you average those two scales of political rights and civil liberties, and you average all the regions and countries in the world, this is what you get. Again, it's very interesting. An inflection point right around 2006. Keep in mind, as the number gets lower, freedom gets better. That's the way Freedom House scores their numbers. So we have freedom peaking in 2006 at about 3.2 for the world, for all the states in the world. The red line is for developing countries. And again, it's subsided since. The subsiding has been very gradual, okay? But what worries me is that these numbers may not be capturing the real aggregate deterioration. And moreover, they aren't yet capturing, it's like climate change. Keep in mind that the temperatures we're experiencing now, it's not a switch we can turn off. There's tremendous momentum that is, in the words of my colleagues at Stanford who are climate scientists, they literally use this term, baked in to the current momentum of climate change. So even if we could stop all emissions now, temperatures would rise for a while. And I think that there is a certain momentum to the illiberal trends in the world as well. This, I'm sorry, looks like a badly designed subway map. I'm sure yours is much better here in Seoul. But in any case, these are the trends for each region of the world. And I've made this one thicker because this is the Asia-Pacific region. And you can see it's just about the only region in which the levels have continued to improve right through the end of 2016. Now, how to interpret this? Well, keep in mind it's averaging all countries, small and large, in the region. Keep in mind that this is before Rodrigo Duterte started murdering or got as far along in the process of murdering 7,000 people and more, really, probably dramatically more, on the streets of the Philippines, as he and his police run amok have been doing there. And there are other trends I worry about, but Asia-Pacific has been a hopeful region in a world in the last 10 years that started slipping backward. And I think one of the questions we must ask is this A, illusory? What other trends is it masking? But more to the point, can it be sustained? This is one of the reasons why people are saying we are in a serious and protracted democratic recession. So one of the things you can do with the Freedom House data is just count all the countries that have improved their freedom score from one year to the next. Now, behind the 7-point scales are two subscales. Political rights ranges from 0 to 40. Civil liberties ranges from 0 to 60. You can add them up, you got a 100-point scale, and you can look for more modest changes from one year to the next. So this slide compares all the countries that have improved even a little in their overall freedom score with all the countries that have declined even a little in their freedom score. And many countries don't change at all from one year to the next. And what you should note here are two things. Number one, big change in the pattern. In the early post-Cold War era, from 1991 until 2005, you can see in most years the balance was favorable. 2.5 times, 1.5 times, 1 year 3 times as many countries improved in their freedom score compared to the number that declined. There were only a couple of years when the balance was negative, and in only one of those years was it seriously negative. So it's a 15-year, quite positive trend of countries generally moving forward at least a little bit toward better levels of freedom. Now look what happens, again, beginning in 2006. The pattern begins to change. And after 2006, we start to see a very significant balance in the other direction, where, to summarize crudely, only about half as many countries are gaining in freedom as the number that are losing in freedom for each of about the last 10 years. That, I think, if I was going to show you one slide to show the democratic recession and the change in the world, this is the one you should pay attention to. But there are other things going on. Democratic breakdowns and losses of various kinds are becoming more likely. It's no longer just the kind of old-fashioned dramatic change that you experienced here in Korea at one point of a military coup overturning a popularly elected government. That happened in Thailand, but it's no longer the most common way that democracy is lost. Generally, it gets lost when popularly elected leaders like Erdogan in Turkey and Orban in Hungary and Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and so on, gradually strangle democracy. They go after the courts and other institutions. I'll talk about it. The result is that if you break down the roughly 4 decades of the third wave of democratization and ask what percentage of democracies failed in each of those decades, this is what you find. In the first decade of the third wave, about 1 in 6 of all the democracies that existed, nearly 17%, broke down in some way at some point. If you then look at the subsequent 2 decades, the failure rate in the decade declined to less than 10%. And now, look at the 11-year period from 2006 through the end of last December, and the failure rate is back to nearly 16%. So that should alarm us. Why is this happening? Why do we have this pattern of a democratic recession and rising democratic breakdowns? I think the most important reason is the weakness of the rule of law and bad governance. If you want to stop this, improve the quality of governance. If I have to say it in one sentence, that's my strongest appeal. You have weak, ineffective, often corrupted judiciaries, weak, ineffectual monitoring institutions. So most of these countries have counter-corruption agencies. They're just a joke. They don't do anything to control corruption at high levels. And as a result, politicians and state officials run amok with the public's resources. And, if economic development happens, it happens in ways that do not result in broad improvements in human well-being. And with that goes human rights violations, usually with considerable impunity, and sometimes very significant violence and crime. Secondly, and related to that, then, if the institutions of constraint are weak, not only in the political system, but in civil society, you get executives abusing power. And once they abuse power and find they can get away with it, it's just kind of human nature to keep on taking and taking and taking and aggrandizing power until you don't have democracy at all. Which is why I think we all, as Democrats, need to be extremely vigilant in the face of illiberal populism. And I do not only say that generally about the world. I can tell you that political scientists and civil society organizations feel that very strongly about the United States as well. Thirdly, we find in these cases of democratic breakdown very commonly severe polarization around party, ethnicity, religion, class lines, some kind of identity lines, or sometimes political party becomes such an intense identification. And I think this has begun to happen in the United States and your country and Taiwan and some others, where that's enough. That becomes an identity in itself. And generally, weak political institutions that lack public faith and confidence, often with this goes poor, if not very bad, economic performance. So you get a syndrome. Now, I had a hypothesis years ago when I started looking at these patterns that bad governance was the most important cause of this democratic recession. And so I did something very simple to try and interrogate this. I took the Freedom House scales of political rights and civil liberties and broke them down from 2 scales into 3. So now we have a scale of transparency and the rule of law as well. I just took those measures out of the other two and created a third scale. And now I've just standardized it so it's easier to see and interpret from 0 to 1. 0 is the worst, 1 is the best. And what you see here in sub-Saharan Africa, the pattern holds in different ways in different regions, is that here in sub-Saharan Africa and in most regions of the world, the scale that performs worst is transparency and the rule of law. It's the weakest of the three. And it's also, between 2005 and 2016, the one that has declined the most. This is the pattern in Latin America. That scale, transparency, and the rule of law actually hasn't declined much. The other two have declined some. But it is the one that is by far the lowest of the three. This is the pattern for the Asia. Again, Northeast, Southeast, and South Asia. Again, not much decline, but a considerable difference, a considerable gap from the others. Now, Ambassador Park asked about the Middle East and used the word Arab freeze. Very good term. That is what has happened. Another depressing feature of this late period of the third wave of democratization is that the Arab Spring has turned out to be a huge and tragic disappointment. 6 countries actually experienced intense mobilization for political liberalization, if not democratization. Egypt, and certainly Tunisia, where it started, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. Only one of those became a democracy, Tunisia, and it's now a fairly liberal democracy. Is it progress that the Arab world has gone from no democracies to one, and one that's doing better than might have been expected? Or should we mainly be concerned by all these red arrows that most of the Arab countries that changed in their levels of freedom between 2010 and 2016 got worse? My brief response to your question, Mr. Ambassador, is that political parties and other institutions, including states, were very weak, and there was very little experience with democracy and very little time to development. Look, I say to people, democratic progress is usually more sustainable if it's incremental. I don't want to see the Chinese Communist Party collapse tomorrow. Because if it did, I fear they'd have a Vladimir Putin and possibly worse in China. I would much rather see the Chinese Communist Party engage in a sustained, planned pattern of liberalization that gradually opens up the country in the way the KMT did in Taiwan. And I think China has now reached a level of economic development where it could have a lot of success at that if it did it. The problem is it's not going to do it. And I think what we learned from the Arab Spring and what the Chinese leadership will experience at some point is that, when you have decades of stability, as Egypt did, you can delude yourself into thinking it's because the people love you. It's because your institutions work and are infallible, or at least your security institutions are infallible. And that's a risky proposition, because when something happens, like the circumstances that gave rise to a popular uprising in these 6 Arab countries and a lot of demonstrations elsewhere in 2010 and 2011, there will be a crisis and there will be a severe existential challenge to the regime, as there was in China in 1989. I personally think that if anything like Tiananmen happens again in China, it will be the end of Chinese communist rule, because the society is much more resourceful, much more networked, much better connected, with much more civic self-confidence. and to use the communist language, a much stronger bourgeoisie that they may think are members of the Communist Party, but most of them are purely tactical members, and I don't think they will show any loyalty at all to the Chinese Communist Party if it falls into crisis. So it wasn't gradual. They weren't well prepared. The political institutions were extremely shallow and weak. And the last thing is that we have to look at the behavioral choices that actors made. The country that was, of the bigger countries, best positioned to maybe sustain some kind of political opening was Egypt. And there, the Muslim Brotherhood behaved exactly the opposite of the Islamist Party in Tunisia. Rather than realizing their fragility, as the Islamists did in Tunisia, and embracing democratic values of tolerance and cooperation, and making the strategic choice, in the language of the great book by Guillermo O'Donnell and Philippe Schmitter on democratic transitions, to underutilize their power. They sought, out of panic and ideological fanaticism, to overutilize their power and to try and concentrate control for fear that they would lose power if they didn't do that. And the society wouldn't stand for it, the economy plummeted as a result, and they were overwhelmed with popular demonstrations that basically invited the military to come back in. So that's a partial and brief response to your question. Now let me move through this more quickly because I realize I only have a few minutes left. We are seeing the rise of a new class of populist, illiberal politicians and rulers around the world. Keiko Fujimori in Peru isn't a ruler yet, but she would dearly like to be. And these others I think you're well familiar with. It's a very slippery slope and a very natural slope sliding down from populist, illiberal politics in a not very institutionalized democracy into authoritarianism. And that is the path I believe the Philippines is already well along. You now have the distinguished president, longtime president of the Mongolian Judo Association, a very, very wealthy mining entrepreneur named Batulga, who's just been elected president of Mongolia, and I would watch what happens in Mongolia. I'm worried about it. You've seen the politics of France with Marine Le Pen and the mobilization of PIS, the Law and Justice Party in Poland. All of these are manifestations of the contemporary phenomenon of illiberal populism, which has the following dimensions. Number one, it's anti-elitist. It is very, very disparaging of all elites, and it basically classes all elites together as a corrupt class. That is the single most, I know I need to get rid of this, but I'm afraid that I might hit the wrong thing here, so somebody should come up and get rid of it for me. Number two, it's anti-pluralist. That means, and this is true of all the contemporary illiberal populists in the world, thank you, they do not recognize the legitimacy of competition and difference. And so they say things like, you know, the country is a mess and I am the only one who can save you. And all those other people there don't really represent a legitimate political alternative. They are certainly anti-institutionalist. They're very contemptuous of existing parties, legislators, and agencies of horizontal accountability. They have hegemonic tendencies. It's a natural, logical extension of all the other things that they say and represent. And so you see Orban and now Law and Justice in Poland moving to try and permanently cripple the opposition and to change the electoral landscape in a way so that hopefully they'll never come back to power, because they view the opposition as morally illegitimate. They like plebiscites. They like a direct relationship between themselves and the people. And at a minimum, they treat a competitive presidential or parliamentary election as a plebiscite. And once they win, they believe it should give them, pretty much unlimited power to rule. They are not tolerant of other religions than the primary cultural group they represent, or ethnic minorities or political minorities. And they tend to be hyper-nationalist and to berate and oppose globalization. I'm going to skip this and go to social media and its impact on polarization, and I just say what I think you know and are talking about in Korea. It's become a serious part of the problem. And we need to think about not state regulation, but what can civil society do? What can educational institutions do to begin to foster civility in cyberspace and a more critical disposition to online information? I've got a colleague at Stanford. His name is Sam Weinberg in the School of Education, who's been doing research on how Stanford students, now I will tell you, as I think a woman in this room knows intimately, Stanford students are very smart, okay? I'm not saying they're smarter than your students here at Seoul National University or Korea University or wherever it might be, but they're very smart. And you would expect them to be questioning, discriminating. They're not. They get a news story and they've got only a 50% chance, this is what the research shows, of determining whether it's fake news or not. And in case you haven't noticed, a monkey guessing randomly could get to 50%. So we are not training our young people in the United States, I'm going to presume in Korea, or virtually anywhere else, not to mention our adults, with the skills and the critical faculties that could enable them to question whether what they're reading is really legitimate or not. And to do that, you got to break out of your social media bubble and stop reading vertically, into all the links down into the article or claim or the website, and start being critically minded again and looking around and doing research and investigating other sites and being a questioning citizen. So I think we can teach this. I think we can cultivate this. I think the state can support educational and civic actors to do this, but it's not primarily the state's role to regulate this. Then we are facing an authoritarian resurgence from countries like Russia, China, and Iran that is very, very serious. And if any of you are interested in this, I would recommend to you the book we edited 2 years ago out of the Journal of Democracy in Washington, D.C. called Authoritarianism Goes Global. These are the different elements of it. I'm not going to read this slide. And by the way, Ambassador Park, I invite you to make my slides available to anyone who wants them. But I will say this. We are in a new era because the geopolitical dynamism now of pushing values, pushing ideas, pushing a narrative about the type of regime that is good and successful does not lie with the democracies of the world. It lies with Russia, China, Iran, ISIS, and so on. And I think if we want to reverse the global democratic recession, which I do believe is at very serious risk of becoming a depression, in other words, a genuine crisis, we have to go back to what we once did and believed in, which is fighting for and promoting democratic ideas and values, and pushing back against the cultural and soft power expansion of China and Russia, and now I think it must be said, pushing back against the hard power and military expansion of China and Russia. We got 100,000 Russian troops and a very significant number of Russian tanks that are pouring into Belarus, preparing for military exercises with NATO in their sights. This is not, just a kind of soft cyber war against American democracy or Ukrainian democracy. This is back to Cold War era of geopolitical threat and military threat. And if you see not only what China is doing in the South China Sea and the way it has intimidated the Philippines and now Vietnam, and frankly is stealing their resources, and what China is now doing on the border between Bhutan, India, and China, this is becoming very, very serious. Authoritarian regimes feel like they're on a roll in terms of soft power and in terms of hard power, and that democracies have lost confidence and will to defend themselves, defend their values, and fight back. And if you look at what happened during World War II, or in the lead up to World War II, I'm sorry to articulate this here, but we know where this leads. And so I think we can't do it alone anymore. That is something where I do agree with President Trump. We can't do it alone anymore. And you are now, the Republic of Korea, a mature democracy with a lot of resources, and I am told a $3 billion development assistance budget. We really need your help, at least in Asia. And I would implore you in this room to really launch a conversation in Korean society about how this now mature, and I know a lot of people in this room may be very critical of it, but I would say it's still very impressive democracy could do something intentional and creative to support Democrats elsewhere in Asia. I will just say there is a debate now about the deconsolidation of Western democracies. What we do find is rising support for illiberal options and alternatives in the United States, more value skepticism about democracy. It's not yet a crisis, but it is worrisome when the percentage of people in a public opinion survey in the United States who say, yeah, army rule, that would not be a bad way to rule the United States, goes from 1 in 16, that is 6%, to 1 in 6 in the space of 16 years. I don't have data more recent than 2011, but given what happened in our elections last year, I don't think that percentage has declined in the last 6 years. And, you can see the trend in trust in government, trust in politicians, trust in parliament, and this helps to explain why we're in this situation. These, I think, are some of the possible causes of the now gathering democratic crisis that we are in. They include the economic stagnation and decline, the rising inequality, the flat real wages as a result of globalization, automation, and so on, that many mature economies are having to come to grips with, not only in the United States and Europe, but in Northeast Asia. And when the middle class is falling and real wages are flat, and people feel that the dream of prosperity that they could imagine and achieve for themselves is no longer possible for their children, that is the single most ripe condition for the rise of illiberal populism. When you add to that something you don't have much of here, but we're struggling with, particularly in Europe, which is widespread immigration, that adds to the mix as well. Then you have accelerating globalization in terms of the movement of people, of goods and capital, and so on, as well as immigrants, and this becomes an easy scapegoat, and it is generating more stresses. I've referred to another factor, and I worry about it, and I think it is a major reason why we've seen so much democratic slippage, and that is the period from the end of the Cold War, or really the mid to late 1980s, until the early 2000s, was a period when the United States in particular, and the Western alliance more broadly, particularly its partners in Europe, were very confident about, and I'd say somewhat skillful about, and quite resourceful and persistent in trying to promote and support democracy. And that has really gone south now, and I'm sorry to say it's going south in terms of visible American policy. I'm sure a number of you are wondering, why 2006? What happened then? Well, the beginnings of economic downturn were then. I think that there were gathering stresses in a lot of the new democracies that emerged in not very propitious places that were coming to exert themselves then. But think about what happened 2-3 years before 2006 and what was still going on in 2006, 2007, an American invasion of Iraq that had to be justified on the basis of democracy promotion because we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. And the result of that is that democracy promotion came to be identified with the use of military force, that's not what democracy promotion is. It's about peaceful partnerships to support Democrats and democratic institutions in the world. But that provoked a reaction, not only among people who said in Europe and the United States, well, if this is democracy promotion, we shouldn't be projecting power that way. The price is too high. It doesn't work. Why are we doing it? It caused the United States, including a person with deep moral convictions, President Obama, to pull back and pull back and pull back. And we're now at a point where in Cambodia, in Uganda, in Kenya in this election, watch what happens. Not to mention in much more brazenly authoritarian regimes. Rulers now think they have a blank check. They can rule as nastily as they want. They can repress, lock up, and kill whoever they want. And the democracies of the world are not going to complain, and there are going to be no consequences for foreign aid, for diplomacy, or for anything else. This, to my mind, is the single biggest reason why we have a democratic recession. I'm just going to close on this note because I know that you're going to have a lot of questions. Friends, we live in a globalized world. The single most important insight of Samuel Huntington's book, The Third Wave, is not that there was a third wave, okay? I think eventually we would have figured that out. It's just a question of numbers. It is that what the international community did, including a lot of things that looked very long-term and iffy, like the support for the Solidarity trade movement in Poland, what the international community did to support civil society, to support democratic movements, to use aid and diplomacy as levers, as we did here in 1987 when the Reagan administration, I know many of you in this room are not big fans of the Reagan administration, but read George Shultz's memoirs. The Reagan administration sent a very clear signal to your military president, Chun Doo-hwan, that if he murdered the demonstrators in Seoul, he was going to be finished in terms of U.S. relations. I don't know what he would have done if he hadn't gotten that message, but I think it's clear that it discouraged him from doing something terrible. Where are the democracies who are delivering those kinds of messages to similar autocrats in the world today? Sorry to have gotten so worked up. Thank you, Ambassador Park, for your kind invitation.